The barrel of Hal Bryson's Colt, .45, gleamed in the dying afternoon light as he pressed it against Evelyn Harker's temple. Her 6-year-old daughter Clara whimpered behind her mother's worn skirts, clutching a threadbare doll with one missing button eye, the only treasure salvaged from their burning cabin. "You got 10 minutes to gather what you can carry." Bryson snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. Spittle flecked his gray beard as he spoke. "Then you and that spawn of yours get off my land permanently." Evelyn's hands trembled as she knelt beside their meager pile of possessions scattered in the dirt: a dented cast-iron pot, 2 wool blankets riddled with moth holes, Clara's few remaining clothes, and a small leather pouch. Hidden beneath Clara's spare dress was something precious, a folded letter in Thomas's handwriting that she discovered sewn into his coat lining after the funeral. The thick paper crackled against her fingers, and she sensed its importance even without having read it. The December wind swept down from the Bighorn Mountains like frozen daggers, and her breath came in sharp puffs of vapor. Each gust cut through her patched coat with vicious precision, and she could already feel the deadly chill beginning to settle into her bones. "Please, Mr. Bryson," she murmured, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the gun barrel pressed against her skull. "Thomas worked your cattle for 3 years faithful. We got nowhere else to go with winter coming on strong." Bryson's weathered face twisted into a cruel grin, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Should have thought of that before your husband started poking his nose where it didn't belong, asking questions about land deeds and mineral rights." He spat into the frozen dirt near Clara's feet and the brown glob steaming in the bitter air. "Time's up, widow woman." The terror in Clara's eyes cut through Evelyn's heart like a blade. This child had already lost her father to what everyone called an accident. But Evelyn had begun to suspect otherwise. Thomas's final weeks had been filled with worry and secret meetings, conversations that ended abruptly when she entered rooms. Now facing Bryson's naked hatred, she understood that her husband's death might have been no accident at all. When Evelyn hesitated, still stuffing Clara's spare dress into a burlap sack with shaking fingers, Bryson whistled sharply through his teeth. 3 ranch dogs, lean scarred beasts with wolf blood in their veins, came loping around the corner of the bunkhouse, their yellow eyes fixed hungrily on the mother and daughter. "I said run," Bryson commanded, raising his pistol toward the darkening sky and pulling back the hammer with a metallic click. "Now, before I change my mind about letting you leave breathing." The dogs snarled and snapped their foam-flecked jaws inches from Clara's legs. Evelyn grabbed her daughter's hand and stumbled toward the gate, but not before she caught sight of Buck Morrison, Bryson's foreman, emerging from the shadows with a satisfied smirk. His hand rested casually on his gun butt, and his eyes held the predatory gleam of a man who enjoyed others' suffering. Evelyn and Clara ran across the frozen yard, their boots slipping on patches of ice while the pursuing hounds bayed behind them. They passed the corrals where Thomas had mended fences just weeks before his death in the cattle stampede, past the hay barn, where he'd shared dreams of owning their own small spread someday. The cottonwoods along the riverbank provided their only refuge from the pursuing animals. Evelyn pressed Clara against the rough bark of the largest tree, both of them gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. Behind them, orange flames licked at the evening sky as Bryson's men systematically burned the rest of their belongings. Thomas's spare boots curling in the heat, Evelyn's sewing basket crackling as the needles melted the quilt her mother had stitched for Clara's birth, dissolving into ash and sparks. "Mama, I'm cold," Clara whispered, her lips already turning blue despite the wool scarf wrapped around her neck. Her small body shook with violent shivers, and ice crystals formed on her eyelashes with each labored breath. Evelyn pulled her daughter closer, feeling Clara's sharp shoulder blades through her thin coat. The child had grown dangerously thin over the past month. Ever since Thomas's death, their food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. They had no remaining provisions. Their last strips of jerky and hardtack biscuits had been confiscated by Bryson that morning, along with everything else of value. As they huddled together in the growing darkness, Clara began her ritual, a game she'd invented after Thomas's death to cope with loss. She would arrange small objects in patterns, telling stories about each one, as if they were living beings protecting her from the chaos of adult cruelty. "Mama," Clara said softly, arranging 3 smooth pebbles in a triangle on the frozen ground. "Tell me again why Papa had to go away." The question pierced Evelyn's heart. How could she explain to a 6-year-old that her father might have been murdered, that the accident with the cattle might have been deliberate, that powerful men sometimes killed those who threatened their secrets? "Papa had to go to heaven, sweetheart." She said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "But he's still watching over us. Will he help us find somewhere warm to sleep?" Evelyn closed her eyes, remembering Thomas's final words before the spooked cattle had trampled him. "Evelyn, if anything happens to me, you take Clara and you survive. Promise me you'll fight for her, no matter what comes. And if you ever find the letter I hid, take it to someone you trust completely." At the time, she thought he was being overly cautious. Now she understood he'd been trying to prepare her for this moment. The promise felt like lead in her chest, but it also gave her strength. As darkness fell and temperatures plunged toward 0, she knew they couldn't survive another hour in the open without shelter. The nearest town lay 40 miles south, through country known for sudden blizzards and roving bands of desperate men who preyed on travelers. That night, as brutal wind began building over the mountains, Evelyn made a decision born of desperation. She'd heard whispers among the ranch hands about forbidden Cheyenne hunting grounds 15 miles northwest territory that even Bryson's hardest men avoided. They claimed the Indians would scalp any white trespasser on sight, but legends and fear meant nothing when Clara's breathing grew shallow from the intensifying cold. By midnight, Clara's shivering had become violent spasms, and her breathing grew labored. Evelyn recognized the early signs of hypothermia, and panic clawed at her throat as she understood they had perhaps an hour before the condition became irreversible. She lifted Clara onto her back and began walking upstream along the ice-choked Powder River, following animal trails that wound deeper into the wilderness. The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing driving snow horizontally across the landscape and reducing visibility to mere feet. Every step became a calculated risk. The riverbank was treacherous, with hidden ice patches and snow-covered obstacles that could trip them or plunge them into the freezing water. Clara's weight grew heavier with each mile, but Evelyn forced herself to maintain steady progress, knowing that stopping meant death for both of them. After 3 hours of brutal travel, she realized her initial plan to simply find shelter and wait for better weather was hopelessly naive. They needed fire food and protection from the elements, none of which she could provide with her current resources. But Thomas had been a practical man, and he taught her basic principles of survival during their years on the frontier. "When you're truly desperate," he'd once said, "you use whatever the land gives you, and you think like the animals that manage to survive here." Looking around with new eyes, Evelyn began to notice signs she'd missed before: animal tracks in the snow browse marks on tree branches, the subtle paths that marked regular travel routes for deer and elk. If animals could survive in this wilderness, there had to be ways for humans to do the same. She found what she was looking for near a cluster of wind-bent pines, a natural depression in the ground where animals had sheltered, marked by scattered droppings and matted vegetation. More importantly, she spotted the faint impression of a trail leading to what appeared to be a regular water source. Working with numb fingers, she began constructing a trap using techniques Thomas had shown her years earlier. She bent a flexible branch into a snare, weighted it with stones, and positioned it along the animal trail using her last piece of twine, a shoelace pulled from Clara's boot. The trap was crude and might not work, but it represented hope. While she waited, she gathered dry bark and pine needles, preparing to build a fire with her last 3 precious matches if the snare produced results. Clara had fallen into a dangerous stupor, her body's natural response to extreme cold. Evelyn knew this was actually a bad sign. When hypothermia victims stopped shivering, it meant their bodies were beginning the process of shutting down. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, rubbing Clara's hands and face to maintain circulation. Papa's watching over us, remember? He's going to help us find food and warmth. An hour before dawn, she heard rustling in the brush near her makeshift snare. Moving carefully to avoid frightening whatever creature she might have caught, Evelyn approached the trap with Thomas's hunting knife in her trembling hand. She found a scrawny jackrabbit there, its hind leg caught in her improvised snare, but very much alive. The animal's dark eyes were wide with terror. And for a moment, she hesitated, remembering gentler times when Thomas brought home game. And she never had to witness the killing. But Clara moaned softly in her sleep, and the sound hardened Evelyn's resolve. Survival demanded sacrifices, and this rabbit's death might mean her daughter's life. She ended the animal's suffering quickly, and began the grisly work of preparing it for cooking. Her hands were so cold she could barely feel the knife, and several times she nearly dropped it into the snow. Blood steamed in the frigid air as she worked, and she found herself grateful for the darkness that hid the worst of the butchering from Clara's innocent eyes. As she built her fire with bark and pine needles, using her second-to-last match, smoke began to drift up through the branches, a gray column that could be seen for miles in the clear mountain air. She knew this was dangerous, that smoke might attract unwanted attention. But Clara needed warm food more than they needed concealment. The rabbit was thin and stringy, barely enough meat for one adult meal, but it was protein and warmth. As the smell of cooking meat filled the small clearing, Clara began to stir from her hypothermic stupor. "Mama," she whispered, "something smells good. I caught us some supper, sweetheart, just like Papa taught me." But even as she tended the cooking meat, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times, she glanced up from the fire, scanning the dark tree line for movement, or the glint of eyes reflecting firelight. She never heard the moccasined footsteps approaching through the snow, never detected the presence of the man who had been tracking them for the past hour, drawn by the smoke from their desperate fire. "A white woman," a deep voice said in carefully pronounced English. "You hunt on Cheyenne land without permission." Evelyn spun around to find herself staring down the barrel of a Winchester rifle, held by a man who seemed to have materialized from the shadows themselves. He stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, his long black hair braided with strips of leather and decorated with eagle feathers. His dark eyes studied her with the predatory focus of a hawk, taking in every detail of their desperate situation. Buckskin leggings and a heavy wool coat marked him clearly as Cheyenne, one of the warriors she'd been warned about since childhood. The stories she'd heard painted these men as savage killers who tortured captives and took scalps as trophies. But looking at him now, she saw not a monster, but a man with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in this harsh landscape. We have nowhere else to go," she stammered instinctively, stepping in front of Clara to shield her daughter from whatever might come next. The warrior's gaze moved to the child, taking in her hollow cheeks, the way her small body still shook, despite the warmth from the fire and the blue tinge around her lips that spoke of serious cold exposure. His expression didn't soften exactly, but something flickered behind those dark eyes, perhaps recognition of genuine desperation rather than mere trespassing. "My name is Wicasa," he said, his accent thick, but his words clearly articulated. "And you trespass on sacred hunting grounds that feed my people through the long winter months." Clara had awakened fully now and was staring at the tall stranger with wide, curious eyes rather than fear. Children, Evelyn realized, often possessed a clarity of judgment that adults had lost to prejudice and learned hatred. "Are you going to hurt us?" Clara asked with startling directness. Wicasa studied the child for a long moment before responding. "That depends on why you are here and what you intend." "Please," Evelyn said, raising her hand slowly and trying to keep her voice steady. "My daughter is sick from the cold. We just need shelter until the weather breaks. I can pay." "Ah, with what?" Wicasa interrupted, gesturing with his rifle toward their pathetic pile of possessions. "You have nothing we need." But even as he spoke, his attention was drawn to something else. The way Clara had arranged her 3 pebbles near the fire. The careful precision with which she'd placed them in a triangle pattern that reminded him of something from his own childhood. "And the stones," he said quietly. "What do they mean?" Clara looked down at her pebbles, then back up at the warrior. "This one is Papa in heaven, this one is Mama, and this little one is me. Papa protects us, even though he's not here anymore." Something shifted in Wikasa's expression. He lowered his rifle slightly and studied Evelyn with new interest. "Your husband is dead. Last month. Cattle stampede." The words came out flat and bitter, carrying all the weight of her suspicions about Thomas's death. "You are the woman whose man died in Bryson's south pasture," Wikasa said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn blinked in surprise. "You know about Thomas. Word travels quickly among my people. White rancher's cattle killed your husband, and the same rancher cast you out into winter without provisions." His voice carried a bitter edge that spoke of personal experience with such cruelty. "This Bryson, he takes what is not his and destroys what he cannot possess." Before Evelyn could respond, a low, rumbling growl cut through the night air. 50 yards away, between 2 towering pines, a massive gray wolf stepped into the circle of firelight. The animal was clearly starving. Its ribs showed through matted fur, and its yellow eyes held the desperate gleam of a predator driven to madness by hunger. Wikasa's rifle swung toward the wolf without hesitation, the movement fluid and practiced. The animal gathered itself to spring, muscles bunching beneath its mangy hide like coiled steel. Its ears flattened against its skull, and a snarl rumbled from deep in its chest as saliva dripped from its bared fangs. The Winchester's boom echoed across the valley like thunder, sending sleeping birds exploding from nearby trees in panic. The wolf dropped mid-leap, its body crashing into the snow 6 feet from where Clara sat, dark blood spreading beneath it like spilled ink. Clara jolted at the gunshot but didn't scream. Instead, she looked up at Wikasa with something approaching gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. "More will come," Wikasa said grimly, ejecting the spent shell and loading a fresh cartridge with practiced efficiency. "The gunshot will carry for miles, and wolves hunt in packs when prey is scarce." As if summoned by his words, distant sounds reached them through the trees, multiple horses moving at speed through the underbrush, their passage marked by snapping branches and shouted commands. Even from a distance, Evelyn could hear Buck Morrison's harsh voice, directing his men to spread out and search the area. "Bryson's men," she said, her heart sinking like a stone in her chest. "They must have followed our tracks from the river." Wikasa studied her face in the flickering firelight, seeing something there that made him come to a decision. The hardness in his expression remained, but it was tempered now with what might have been sympathy. "Can you walk through difficult terrain in darkness?" "Yes, but Clara, I will carry the child." He slung his rifle across his back with practiced ease and lifted Clara with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest like precious cargo. "There is a place I know, safe from white men's eyes. But we must move quickly and quietly." A rifle shot cracked through the darkness, followed by Morrison's rough voice shouting orders to his men. They were perhaps half a mile away, but closing fast, their horses' hooves drumming against the frozen ground like distant thunder. Wikasa kicked dirt over their fire, plunging them into darkness, lit only by stars and a thin crescent moon. "Stay close behind me. Step where I step. Make no sound." They began moving north along the frozen creek, leaving behind the relative warmth and safety of their fire for the unknown dangers of the Cheyenne wilderness. Evelyn cast one last glance at the dead wolf, wondering if its fate was an omen of their own. They traveled along the creek bed for what felt like hours, and the icy water numbing Evelyn's feet through her worn boots as they splashed through shallow pools that hadn't yet frozen solid. Wikasa moved like a ghost through the treacherous terrain. never disturbing loose stones or snapping branches, his moccasins finding purchase on surfaces where Evelyn's hard-soled boots slipped and skidded. Behind them, Morrison's search party had spread out through the forest, and their torches bobbing like angry fireflies as they examined every depression and overturned log. The sounds of their pursuit grew steadily closer, harsh voices cursing the darkness, horses snorting and pawing at the ground, the occasional crack of a rifle fired at shadows. "She's got to be here somewhere." Morrison's voice carried through the trees, rough with frustration and whiskey. "Bryson wants that woman found, and he's paying $50 gold to whoever brings him her scalp." The casual brutality in his tone made Evelyn's blood run cold. These weren't lawmen pursuing a criminal, they were predators hunting prey for sport and profit. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Wikasa suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. Ahead of them, barely visible in the starlight, lay a section of trail that had been undermined by spring flooding. What appeared to be solid ground was actually a thin crust of frozen earth over a deep washout that could swallow horse and rider alike. "A dangerous crossing," Wikasa murmured. "We go around, but it costs time." They detoured through thick brush that caught at their clothes and scratched exposed skin. Clara had fallen asleep in Wikasa's arms, exhausted by cold and terror. Her small body finally able to rest, now that someone else was bearing her weight. "Why are you helping us?" Evelyn asked quietly as they navigated around the treacherous ground. Wikasa was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your husband was not the first good man Bryson has killed. He will not be the last unless someone stops him." The words sent a chill through Evelyn that had nothing to do with the mounting cold. "You know something about Thomas's death. I know many things about Bryson's activities. Your husband discovered some of them, which is why he died." Before she could ask more questions, they emerged from the brush into a small clearing where a traditional hide tent sat beneath towering ponderosa pines. Smoke rose from a small opening at the top, and the warm amber glow of an oil lamp showed through the tanned buffalo hide walls like a beacon of hope in the wilderness. "You live here alone?" Evelyn asked as Wikasa ducked through the tent's entrance flap. "Winter camp while I scout white settlements for my war chief," he replied, settling Clara onto a pile of thick buffalo robes near a small fire pit lined with smooth river stones. "My people move with the seasons following game and avoiding soldiers." The tent's interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with parfleche containers holding supplies arranged neatly along the walls and weapons hung within easy reach. Everything spoke of a man who lived simply but prepared for any emergency. Clara immediately burrowed into the furs, her violent shivering finally beginning to subside in the blessed warmth. For the first time since leaving Bryson's ranch, she looked like a normal sleeping child rather than a victim of exposure and trauma. Wikasa began preparing tea from dried herbs stored in small leather pouches, his movements economical and sure. As he worked, Evelyn finally had a moment to examine Thomas's hidden letter by the light of the oil lamp. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, recognizing her husband's careful handwriting. The letter was addressed to her, written in Thomas's characteristic precise script. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified, and Bryson has silenced me as he threatened. There are things I should have told you, secrets I kept to protect you and Clara from dangerous knowledge. Bryson runs an illegal operation 15 miles north of his ranch, using forced labor to extract copper from Cheyenne treaty land. White drifters, Mexicans, captured Indians all worked like slaves until they die in those hellish tunnels." Evelyn's hands shook as she read further. Thomas described helping a Cheyenne warrior escape from Bryson's mining operation, a man whose brother had died in the tunnels from lung disease caused by copper dust. "The warrior's name is Wikasa," Thomas had written. "I freed him and several others, but Bryson suspects my involvement. He has sworn to eliminate any threats to his operation, and I fear he means to act soon. Hidden in our cabin's root cellar beneath the loose floorboard, you'll find documents I copied from his files, proof of bribes paid to territorial officials. Maps of Indian lands, marked for seizure records of men who disappeared into his mines. If something happens to me, take these papers to the federal marshal in Cheyenne City. Trust no one else. The corruption reaches higher than you can imagine. The letter ended with Thomas's profession of love and a warning to trust her instincts if anyone claimed his death was accidental. Evelyn looked up to find Wicasa watching her with intense focus, as if he could read her thoughts in her expression. "You know what that says," she said quietly. "I can guess. Your husband was a brave man, but bravery is not always enough against men like Bryson. Thomas helped you escape." Wicasa nodded grimly. "He and I were planning to present evidence against Bryson to territorial authorities. We had arranged to meet after he collected documents from Bryson's files. But your husband never arrived at our meeting place, because Bryson had him killed first. The cattle stampede was no accident. I was watching from the ridgeline when it happened." His voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. "Morrison and 2 others fired shots into the air to spook the herd, just as your husband rode into the valley. They wanted him dead before he could report what he'd discovered." Before Evelyn could respond to this confirmation of her worst fears, the crack of rifle fire echoed from the south, much closer now, perhaps a quarter-mile away. "They found our trail at the creek," Wicasa said, moving to the tent's entrance and peering through a carefully concealed gap in the hide. 5 riders with torches. They will circle this camp before dawn, trying to trap us inside." Evelyn felt panic rising in her throat like bile. "We should run again. Now where would we go?" "The child cannot travel much farther in this weather, and they have horses while we are on foot." Wicasa handed her a cup of herbal tea, its warmth seeping through the metal into her frozen fingers. "Give this to your daughter. The herbs will strengthen her blood and warm her from within." Another gunshot rang out, this one accompanied by Morrison's harsh laughter and the sound of breaking glass, probably shooting at shadows or bottles for entertainment while they waited for dawn. "They'll kill us all when they find us," Evelyn said, stating what seemed like an inevitable fact. Wicasa began methodically checking his rifle, loading fresh cartridges into the magazine and testing the action to ensure it wouldn't jam at a crucial moment. Perhaps. But they will discover that killing Cheyenne warriors is not as simple as murdering helpless farmers. As Clara sipped the warm tea, color slowly returned to her pale cheeks and her breathing became less labored. She looked up at Wicasa with the curious, unguarded gaze that only children possessed. "Are you really an Indian like Mama says?" she asked with startling directness. "I am Cheyenne," he replied with grave seriousness, as if speaking to an adult. "My people have lived on this land since the world was young and the first snows fell on these mountains. Mama says Indians are dangerous and they hurt white people." Wicasa glanced at Evelyn, who flushed red with embarrassment at her daughter's innocent repetition of common prejudices. "Some white men are dangerous too," he said gently. "The men hunting your mother, they are the truly dangerous ones. They would harm a child to satisfy their greed." Clara nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. "They burned all our clothes and Papa's tools." "Yes, I saw the smoke from their fires." His voice hardened slightly. "Destroying what they cannot take it is one way men show their cruelty." Outside, the voices were getting closer. Morrison was directing his men to spread out and form a perimeter around the clearing, cutting off any escape routes. They'd found the tent and were preparing for a siege. As they waited in tense silence for the attack to begin, Wicasa began rolling up his sleeves to better grip his rifle. In the lamplight, Evelyn saw thick, raised scars around both his wrists, unmistakable marks of heavy shackles worn for extended periods. "My God," she breathed. "What did they do to you?" Wicasa's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice carefully controlled, but edged with suppressed rage that had been building for years. 3 summers ago, Bryson's men captured me and my brother Running Bear during a hunting expedition. They killed our cousin Yellowhawk and wounded 2 others before dragging us away in chains. He described the hellish conditions in Bryson's copper mine. 12 men of various races, chained in a cabin like animals, forced to work 16-hour shifts in tunnels that regularly collapsed from poor construction and deliberate neglect. The guards fed them scraps like dogs and beat anyone who showed weakness or defiance. Running Bear was strong and proud, a warrior who'd once counted coup against crow raiders. But 6 months of breathing copper dust destroyed his lungs. He died coughing up blood, cursing Bryson's name, and making me promise to avenge our people. Wikasa's eyes grew distant with the memory. I held him as he died, whispering the death songs our grandfather taught us. When the mine had a cave-in that killed 4 men, I used the confusion to break my chains with a mining pick and escape. That's when Thomas found you. I had been hiding in the hills for weeks, gathering strength and planning my return to free the others. Your husband discovered the mine while tracking stolen horses for another rancher. Most white men would have ridden away, pretending they'd seen nothing. Thomas dismounted and came close enough to see what Bryson was doing to us. Wikasa explained how Thomas had returned 3 nights later with metal files cutting through their chains under cover of darkness. Most of the prisoners had fled immediately, desperate to escape, before dawn brought their captors back. Your husband made me promise to gather evidence before striking back. He said justice through white man's law would be more effective than Cheyenne revenge. We planned to present our evidence together to territorial authorities. From his pack, Wikasa produced a small leather pouch containing documents in various hands, shipping manifests for illegal copper sales correspondence with corrupt officials. And most damning of all, a detailed map showing Cheyenne treaty lands marked for acquisition through systematic displacement of the tribes. Thomas was supposed to bring more evidence from Bryson's personal files. We arranged to meet 3 days before his death, but he never arrived. Because Bryson discovered what he was doing and had him killed first. Evelyn said, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. I watched from the ridge when it happened. Wikasa confirmed, his voice heavy with guilt. I could have warned him, but I was too far away, and by the time I reached the stampede site, it was too late to help. Outside, Morrison's voice cut through the night air with vicious satisfaction. We know you're in there, Evelyn. Come out peaceful-like, and we might let the girl live long enough to see morning. But even as they faced this immediate threat, new sounds reached them. Multiple horses approaching from the north, moving fast, but trying to remain quiet. These weren't Bryson's men. The hoofbeats had a different rhythm, more disciplined and controlled. Wikasa's expression changed as he recognized patterns in those sounds. My people, he said. A war party probably searching for me when I failed to return from scouting. The situation had just become infinitely more complex and dangerous. In minutes, they would be caught between Morrison's killers and a Cheyenne war party with no way to explain their presence or prevent bloodshed that could escalate into open warfare between the races. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when Buck Morrison finally lost patience with waiting. Without warning, he and his men began firing burning brands at the tent from 3 directions, trying to smoke out their quarry like animals from a den. Move now, Wikasa shouted, grabbing Clara, while Evelyn frantically gathered their few supplies, ammunition, dried meat, the precious documents that could bring down Bryson if they survived long enough to present them. They burst from the tent as flames began consuming the hide walls, sending acrid smoke billowing into the morning air. Gunfire erupted immediately from multiple positions. Morrison had spent the night placing his men for maximum tactical advantage. Bullets whined through the air like angry hornets, splintering bark from trees and sending up sprays of snow where they struck the ground. Clara screamed and buried her face against Wikasa's chest as he ran in a zigzag pattern toward the shelter of a rocky outcropping. Evelyn followed, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. A bullet tugged at her sleeve close enough that she felt the heat of its passage. Another shattered stone inches from her head, showering her with sharp fragments that cut her cheek and drew blood that steamed in the bitter air. Behind them, the tent collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame, the buffalo hide crackling and sending pillars of black smoke into the crystal-clear morning sky. The acrid smell of burning leather and singed hair filled the air, making breathing difficult and adding another layer of urgency to their flight. They reached the outcropping just as the Cheyenne war party emerged from the northern tree line. 5 warriors in full battle paint their rifles trained on Morrison's men. The two groups faced each other across the burning clearing, neither sure of the other's intentions, but both ready for violence. In the confusion of crossfire and shouting, Clara stumbled and cried out in pain. Her ankle had twisted in a hidden depression, and tears streamed down her face as she tried to put weight on it. "I can't run anymore, Mama." She sobbed, her small body shaking with exhaustion and terror. "I know, sweetheart." Evelyn panted, lifting her daughter despite her own fatigue. But Clara's additional weight slowed them to a walking pace, making them vulnerable targets for both sets of armed men. Wicasa tried to provide covering fire, but his Winchester jammed after the third shot damage from their desperate flight through the forest had fouled the mechanism with pine needles and frozen dirt. He worked frantically to clear the obstruction, while bullets struck the rocks around them, sending up sparks and chips of stone. "This way," he called, leading them toward a steep slope covered in loose shale and scattered boulders. "We climb, but stay low and move fast." The ascent was treacherous, even under ideal conditions. The shale shifted underfoot with every step, threatening to send them tumbling back down into the guns of their pursuers. Evelyn's muscles burned from carrying Clara, and several times she nearly lost her footing on the unstable surface. Behind them, the battle between Morrison's men and the Cheyenne warriors had erupted into full combat. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as both sides took cover behind trees and rocks, neither able to gain a decisive advantage in the smoke and confusion. One of the younger Cheyenne warriors, a man with fierce eyes and intricate war paint, seemed to be arguing with his companions, gesturing angrily toward Evelyn and Clara. Through fragments of conversation, she could understand it became clear he wanted to kill them all and withdraw, viewing any association with whites as betrayal of his people. Halfway up the slope, loose stones began sliding in earnest as one of Morrison's men found a foothold and started climbing below them. The man, a lean-bearded gunfighter named Colt Stevens, had his .45 drawn and was taking careful aim at Evelyn's back. Wicasa finally cleared his rifle and spun around, but Stevens fired first. The bullet took the Cheyenne warrior in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Blood soaked his shirt, but his grip on the rifle remained steady as he returned fire. Stevens yelped and dove for cover as Wicasa's shot sparked off the rocks where he'd been standing. But the exchange had cost precious time, and more of Morrison's men were finding ways up the slope. At the top of the ridge, they found themselves trapped on a narrow ledge with nowhere left to run. Below them, the Powder River roared through a deep canyon, its waters black and violent from spring snowmelt, far too turbulent and cold to survive a fall. Behind them, flames from the forest fire had spread through dry timber and brush, driven by rising winds that sent sparks swirling through the air like burning snow. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke made breathing increasingly difficult. Clara coughed continuously, her small lungs struggling with the acrid air, while sweat mixed with soot streaked down Evelyn's face. The combination of extreme cold and intense heat from the fire created a hellish environment that seemed designed to test human endurance to its limits. Morrison emerged from the smoke wall with 3 surviving men, their rifles trained on the fugitives. His face was blackened with soot, and his eyes gleamed with savage satisfaction at having finally cornered his prey. "End of the line, Mrs. Harker," he called out, grinning beneath his singed mustache. "Hell of a chase you gave us, but every hunt ends with the kill." He gestured mockingly at their desperate situation trapped between fire and water, with no escape route visible. Mr. Bryson sends his personal regards and wants you to know your husband died squealing like a stuck pig. 2 of the Cheyenne warriors had followed them up the slope, but they hung back uncertainly. The younger warrior, Yellow Wolf, as Wicasa called him, spoke angrily in their native language, his voice carrying clear hostility toward the trapped whites. Wicasa replied in the same language, his voice urgent and pleading, through hand gestures and the few Cheyenne words she'd picked up from ranch hands over the years. Evelyn understood that Yellow Wolf wanted to let Morrison kill them and leave, while Wicasa was arguing desperately for their lives. "What's he saying?" she asked frantically. Yellow Wolf lost his wife and infant son to Bryson's raids last winter. Wicasa explained quickly while keeping his eyes on Morrison's advancing men. He sees all whites as enemies who deserve death. But Standing Bear. He indicated the older warrior with gray streaks in his braided hair. He remembers that your husband tried to stop the attacks on our camps. Yellow Wolf's argument grew more heated, and Evelyn could see murder in his dark eyes. This young warrior had suffered losses that made him view her and Clara not as individuals deserving mercy, but as symbols of everything that had destroyed his family and his people's way of life. "Tell him," she said urgently, shifting Clara's weight in her aching arms. "Tell him that Bryson killed my husband too. Tell him we're fighting the same enemy." Before Wicasa could translate, Morrison raised his rifle to take final aim at Evelyn's heart. But in that crucial moment, several things happened simultaneously that transformed the entire nature of the confrontation. Wicasa, despite his wounded shoulder, hurled a fist-sized stone toward Morrison's left flank. The rock clattered against the cliff face and bounced into the burning brush, creating a brief distraction. Morrison's shot went wide as he instinctively turned toward the sound, expecting an attack from that direction. In the same instant, Evelyn made a desperate decision. Instead of cowering with Clara, she set her daughter down behind a boulder and dove for Morrison's dropped pistol, which had fallen when he ducked away from Wicasa's thrown stone. Yellow Wolf, seeing Morrison's men preparing to shoot a woman who was clearly trying to protect her child, found his warrior's honor conflicting with his hatred of whites. The sight of Evelyn's desperate courage, a mother risking everything to defend her young, resonated with his own memories of his wife's final moments defending their son. Standing Bear, the older warrior, made the decision for all of them. His rifle cracked, and one of Morrison's men spun around, clutching his wounded shoulder as his own pistol flew from nerveless fingers. Morrison, realizing that he was now facing coordinated resistance from both Wicasa and the Cheyenne warriors, made his own desperate play. He charged directly at Wicasa, hoping to take the wounded warrior down with brute force and use him as a human shield against the others. The 2 men collided with bone-jarring impact, both going down hard on the narrow ledge. Morrison was bigger and stronger, but Wicasa fought with the concentrated fury of a man who'd lost everything to Bryson's greed, and now saw a chance for justice. They grappled dangerously close to the cliff's edge, each trying to gain leverage, while avoiding the deadly drop into the churning river below. Morrison managed to wrap his thick fingers around Wicasa's throat, slowly choking the life from him, while using his greater weight to pin the wounded warrior against the rocky ground. But Evelyn had reached Morrison's fallen revolver. The weapon was heavier than she'd expected, and her hands shook from cold fear and exhaustion. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but desperation and her daughter's life depended on her accuracy. The first shot went wide, sparking off rocks near Morrison's head, but serving to distract him from choking Wicasa. The foreman's grip loosened slightly, allowing the Cheyenne warrior to gulp precious air and continue fighting. Yellow Wolf, his internal conflict resolved by the sight of genuine courage and shared purpose, moved to flank the remaining gunman. His war cry echoed off the canyon walls as he charged his own rifle, speaking with deadly precision. But it was Clara who provided the final crucial element. The 6-year-old girl, terrified, but thinking clearly spotted Morrison's lariat still attached to his horse's saddle. The animal had wandered close during the fighting, spooked by the gunfire, but not yet panicked enough to bolt. "Mama," she called out, pointing toward the rope. For the cliff, Evelyn understood immediately. Working with desperate haste, she secured one end of the lariat around a sturdy pine tree, while Morrison and Wicasa continued their death struggle mere feet from the precipice. Wicasa, his strength fading from blood loss and oxygen deprivation, made one final desperate effort. His hand found a loose rock on the ledge, and with his last conscious reserve of power, he brought it up in a vicious arc, striking Morrison's temple with a sound like breaking wood. Morrison's grip loosened, and he staggered backward, blood streaming down his face from the gash in his scalp. But his momentum carried him too close to the edge, and loose gravel gave way beneath his boots. As the foreman began to fall, Wicasa managed to grab the rope Evelyn had secured. Morrison clawed desperately at the Cheyenne warrior, trying to drag him down as well. But Wicasa kicked himself free just as both men went over the cliff's edge. Morrison's scream faded into the canyon depths, ending abruptly when his body struck the rocks below. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like the final note of a funeral dirge. Wicasa dangled from the rope 15 feet down his wounded shoulder, screaming with pain as he fought to maintain his grip. The rope burned his hands as he tried to climb, and several times he nearly lost his hold entirely. "Hold on," Evelyn called down to him. Working together with Yellow Wolf, their previous antagonism forgotten in the crisis of preserving life, they managed to haul Wicasa back up to safety through combined effort that left no doubt about their newfound alliance. The surviving gunman, wounded and abandoned by his dead companions, surrendered without further resistance. Standing Bear spoke briefly with Yellow Wolf in their native language, then turned to Evelyn with something approaching respect in his weathered features. "He says you fight like Cheyenne warrior woman." Wicasa translated, managing a weak smile despite his injuries and exhaustion. "That is high praise from men who have known many brave women." But their immediate danger was far from over. The forest fire continued to spread, driven by increasing winds that sent sparks and burning debris across wider areas. They had perhaps an hour before the flames reached their position, making the narrow ledge uninhabitable. The descent from the burning ridge took most of the day, with the Cheyenne warriors taking turns carrying Clara when her injured ankle couldn't support her weight. Yellow Wolf, despite his initial hostility toward all whites, proved surprisingly gentle with the child, even offering her water from his own supply when she grew thirsty during the difficult journey. Standing Bear led them to a natural cave formation hidden among ancient cottonwoods, a place that had served as temporary shelter for Cheyenne hunting parties for countless generations. The cave provided protection from wind and weather, while offering concealment from any remaining threats. As the older warrior tended their wounds with traditional medicines made from plants and tree bark, Evelyn and Wicasa had their first opportunity to truly compare their evidence against Bryson. The combination of Thomas's carefully copied documents and Wicasa's 2 years of methodical investigation painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond a single greedy rancher. "Look at these shipping records," Evelyn said, studying papers by the light of a small fire they'd built near the cave entrance. "Bryson's been selling copper to buyers in Denver and San Francisco, but according to these territorial documents, that mine doesn't officially exist because it sits on Cheyenne treaty land." Wicasa explained, wincing as Standing Bear applied herbal poultices to his shoulder wound. "Land the government promised would remain ours forever. But Bryson has been paying officials to ignore his theft while he extracts millions of dollars in ore." Yellow Wolf listened to their conversation through Wicasa's translation, his anger growing as he understood the full scope of the betrayal. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations of broken promises and systematic deception. "He says his grandfather signed the first treaty with white government, believing their promises of peace and respect for our boundaries. Wicasa translated. Every treaty since has been broken when white men found something valuable on our land. Over the next several days, as Clara's ankle healed and their wounds began to mend, then the unlikely group developed a routine of cooperation and mutual support. Clara, with a child's remarkable adaptability, began picking up basic Cheyenne words and phrases, delighting the warriors with her pronunciation attempts and innocent questions about their customs. More importantly, she began processing her father's death in healthier ways. Instead of the obsessive arranging of objects that had worried Evelyn, Clara started asking direct questions about Thomas and their situation, seeking understanding rather than retreating into fantasy. "Will the bad man who hurt Papa go to jail forever?" she asked one evening as they sat around their small fire. "If we can prove what he did to a judge and jury, yes," Evelyn replied carefully, not wanting to make promises she couldn't keep. "We good. Papa always said bad people should face consequences for their actions, or they just keep hurting more people." The simple wisdom of her words struck all the adults silent. In her child's understanding of justice, Clara had grasped something that many grown men seem to forget: that evil unchallenged was evil encouraged, and that standing up to wrongdoing was worth any personal risk. During quiet conversations over several evenings, Wicasa shared more details about his brother Running Bear, painting a picture of a young warrior caught between two worlds as the frontier changed around them. Running Bear had tried to adapt to new realities, even learning English and working as a scout for the army before his capture and death in Bryson's mine. He believed whites and Indians could live in peace if both sides showed respect for each other's ways. Wicasa said sadly, staring into the fire. Bryson destroyed that faith along with his lungs. Evelyn found herself sharing memories of Thomas. She'd never spoken aloud, his dreams of building something lasting in the harsh country, his quiet acts of kindness toward the Cheyenne families who sometimes camped near their cabin, his growing concern about Bryson's increasing aggression toward anyone who questioned his methods or challenged his authority. Thomas saw the good in people, she said. He believed most conflicts came from misunderstanding rather than genuine evil. But he also knew that some men chose evil deliberately, and those men had to be stopped. Yellow Wolf, listening through translation, spoke thoughtfully about his own losses and his struggle to distinguish between justified anger and consuming hatred. Through Wicasa's careful interpretation, he described watching his wife and son die during one of Bryson's raids and his long battle to honor their memory without becoming the kind of man who would kill innocents in return. Or, he says, grief can make warriors or it can make monsters. Wicasa translated. The choice belongs to each person who suffers loss. After a week of recovery and planning, they decided it was time to approach territorial authorities with their evidence. But first, they needed to retrieve Thomas's hidden documents from the burned cabin, assuming Bryson's men hadn't already discovered and destroyed them. The return journey to the ranch took 2 days traveling carefully to avoid Bryson's patrols. What they found when they arrived filled them all with determination to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. The cabin had been burned to its foundation, but the root cellar remained intact beneath the charred timbers. Working by moonlight, they carefully excavated the hiding place Thomas had described in his letter. Beneath the loose floorboard wrapped in oiled canvas to protect them from moisture, they found a treasure trove of incriminating documents. Thomas had been methodical in his investigation, copying shipping manifests, correspondence, financial records, and most damning of all, a detailed ledger showing bribes paid to specific territorial officials by name and amount. This is enough to bring down not just Bryson, but half the territorial government, Evelyn said, studying the papers by lamplight. If we can present it to honest authorities, Wicasa replied. The corruption reaches high enough that many judges and marshals might be compromised. Standing Bear, examining the maps that showed systematic encroachment on Cheyenne treaty lands, spoke gravely about the need for swift action before more of his people suffered or died. He says federal authorities in Washington might be our only hope. Wicasa translated. Territorial officials have too much to lose if this evidence becomes public. 2 weeks later, their small group made the long journey to Cheyenne City, where Federal Marshal James Crawford had been summoned by urgent telegrams from both territorial officials and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The sight of their arrival, 5 Cheyenne warriors in full ceremonial dress escorting a white woman and her young daughter through streets filled with curious crowds, was unprecedented in territorial history. Inside the courthouse, the trial began with Evelyn taking the witness stand before a packed gallery that included reporters from newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Her testimony was clear, detailed, and devastating. As she described Thomas's murder, her family's persecution, and the systematic crimes she'd witnessed, Mr. Bryson kept meticulous records of his illegal activities. She explained to the jury, holding up shipping manifests and payment receipts. These documents show he paid bribes totaling over $50,000 to territorial officials, federal agents, and Army officers to ignore his illegal mining operation on Cheyenne treaty land. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed federal attorney named Hamilton Pierce, guided her through each piece of evidence methodically. When he presented the map showing Cheyenne treaty lands marked for acquisition through systematic displacement, angry murmurs rose from the gallery. Bryson's defense attorney, a nervous man named Cornelius Webb, tried desperately to discredit the testimony. He claimed that Indian witnesses couldn't be trusted, that a grieving widow might be mistaken about what she'd seen, and that the evidence had been fabricated by enemies of progress and civilization. But his arguments crumbled when 3 of Bryson's own men took the stand as prosecution witnesses. Faced with lengthy prison sentences themselves, they had agreed to testify truthfully about their boss's crimes in exchange for reduced charges. Jake Morrison, Buck's younger brother, provided the most damaging testimony when he described in detail how Bryson had ordered Thomas Harker's murder. Boss said that Harker fellow was getting too nosy about the mining operation. Morrison testified, his voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. He told us to spook the cattle when Harker rode into the valley, make sure he got trampled good. Said it had to look natural-like or we'd all hang for murder. Standing Bear testified through an interpreter about the mining operation, the forced labor, and the systematic displacement of Indian families. His dignity and careful attention to detail impressed even skeptical observers who had expected unreliable testimony from a savage. Wicasa's testimony proved to be the most dramatic moment of the trial. Still bearing scars from his shoulder wound, he spoke in careful English about his enslavement, his brother's death, and his 2-year campaign to gather evidence against Bryson. "This man destroyed my family," he said, pointing directly at Bryson, who sat in shackles at the defendant's table. "He destroyed this woman's family. He has destroyed many families, white and Indian alike, for nothing but greed and power." The final blow to Bryson's defense came when Territorial Commissioner Franklin Wells, one of the men Bryson had been bribing, was brought from federal custody to testify about the corruption he'd witnessed and participated in. "Bryson paid me $5,000 to approve fake mining claims on Indian treaty land." Wells testified, his voice heavy with shame. He said the federal government didn't really care about Indian rights anyway, that everyone was looking the other way and taking their share. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on 14 counts of murder conspiracy, federal land fraud, and violations of Indian treaty rights. Judge Augustus Whitman, a stern federal appointee known for his integrity, sentenced Bryson to life imprisonment at hard labor, a deliberate irony that wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. As Bryson was led away in chains, he turned to snarl at Evelyn one final time. "You think this ends anything? There's a dozen more like me out there, and they'll come for you eventually. You've made enemies you can't even imagine." But Standing Bear rose from the gallery and spoke a single word in Cheyenne. Every warrior in the room placed his hand on his weapon and their meaning was unmistakable. Let them come. The trial's aftermath brought changes that extended far beyond Bryson's conviction. Federal investigators launched a sweeping inquiry into territorial corruption that ultimately led to the removal of 3 officials from office and the arrest of 2 federal agents. More importantly, the case established legal precedent for Indian testimony in territorial courts and prompted new federal regulations requiring oversight of all mining operations on or near tribal lands. For Evelyn, Clara, and Wicasa, the trial's end marked not the conclusion of their story, but the beginning of a new and more difficult chapter. Using compensation money from Bryson's seized assets, they purchased a small ranch in the valley, where they'd first found shelter-together land that bordered traditional Cheyenne hunting grounds and offered the possibility of building bridges between 2 worlds. The property was isolated enough to provide some protection from hostile neighbors, but close enough to white settlements to ensure Clara could receive proper education and medical care when needed. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered hope for a future neither fully white nor fully Indian, but something new and unprecedented. Their wedding that spring was a small private ceremony that reflected the complex realities of their situation. A Methodist minister performed the legal white ceremony required by territorial law, while Standing Bear conducted traditional Cheyenne vows that bound their spirits according to ancient custom. The handful of witnesses included Yellow Wolf, who had become a trusted friend and protector, and several other Cheyenne warriors who had come to respect Evelyn's courage and commitment to justice. But their new life was far from the peaceful existence either had imagined. Neighboring white ranchers viewed Evelyn as a traitor to her race, while some Cheyenne questioned Wicasa's loyalty to his people. They faced constant challenges from those who believed the races should remain separate and hostile, and who saw any attempt at cooperation as dangerous precedent. Clara, now 8 years old and fluent in basic Cheyenne, often served as translator and mediator when prejudices threatened to create conflict. Her innocent questions and direct observations had a way of cutting through adult complications to reach simple truths about fairness and human decency. No. Why do some people hate others just because they look different? She asked Standing Bear one day as they worked together in their garden. The old chief paused in his weeding to consider the question seriously. Fear of what they do not understand, he replied through Wicasa's translation. And fear that accepting others as equals means admitting they have been wrong about many things. But you and Mama and Wicasa aren't wrong about helping each other. No, little one. But it takes courage to live differently than others expect, and not everyone has such courage. 3 years after the trial, their ranch had become a modest success, raising cattle and horses, while also serving as an unofficial meeting place for whites and Indians seeking peaceful resolution to conflicts. Evelyn and Wicasa worked as interpreters and mediators, using their unique perspective to help others find common ground. Yellow Wolf, who had initially wanted to kill them both, became one of Clara's most devoted teachers and protectors. His transformation from bitter enemy to trusted family member illustrated the possibility of overcoming even the deepest prejudices through shared experience and mutual respect. The final test of their unconventional family came during Clara's 10th birthday, when a group of white ranchers led by one of Bryson's former associates attempted to drive them off their land through intimidation and violence. The attack came at dawn, with armed men surrounding their house and demanding they abandon the property within the hour. But word of the threat had reached Standing Bear's band during the night, and as the sun rose over the mountains, 30 Cheyenne warriors emerged from concealment around the ranch buildings. The would-be attackers found themselves outnumbered and outflanked, facing men who had spent lifetimes learning the arts of war and survival. No shots were fired. The confrontation ended when the leader of the white ranchers looked into Standing Bear's eyes and saw something that made him realize this was not a fight he could win or survive. They withdrew with promises not to return, understanding that this family was under the protection of people who would defend them to the death. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching Clara play with her Cheyenne foster cousins in the meadow while Wikesa tended their horses, Evelyn reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. They had started as strangers thrown together by desperation and violence. But they had become something rarer and more precious, a true family bound not by blood, but by choice, shared hardship, and mutual love. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of that terrible night when their old lives had ended in flames. But those same flames had forged something new and stronger, a bond that no amount of prejudice or hatred seemed able to break. In the distance, smoke rose from the Cheyenne winter camp, where they were always welcome. Closer by, their own cattle grazed contentedly in pastures they had built together with their own hands. Clara's laughter echoed across the valley, mixing with the voices of children who spoke two languages and belonged to two worlds. They were home. They were safe. They were together. And in the harsh beauty of the Wyoming wilderness, surrounded by friends who had once been enemies, that was everything they needed to build a future worth fighting for.